666 The Mark of America, Seat of the Beast. Section 5 The Mark. As humans attempt to exert themselves in discovering self-worth, they experience feelings, then develop attitudes, and then make choices of action. These actions, gestures, and other outward signs are how they define themselves as individuals in comparison to others. Likewise, humans define each other based on their own feelings and attitudes, whether or not the definition lends to a positive or negative impression. The overwhelming evidence of who a person is, or what one has become, remains long after he or she no longer exists among those who were affected by his or her existence. When a standard of human prominence or excellence is conceived or envisioned and accepted by a group of individuals, all others are measured by this standard. The group with the greatest physical strength and power sets the standard by which it expects all others to abide. If others do not live up to this level of quality accepted as the norm, they are branded as substandard and perceived as a threat to the view of the strongest. The strongest group is not necessarily the largest or majority, it is merely the one that has the means of force available to subjugate all others to its standard. Humans create and raise flags as symbols of their standards, and by means of war, protect the flag upon which their standard is based. Judicial systems of law are created to protect the level of human behavior expected when one lives under the auspices of these flags and the governments that protect them. Force is used to take away the free will of the individual who lives contrary or substandard to the measures set by those who have the physical means to take away life or liberty. These systems of law generally do more to protect the image of the established measure than they do to protect the citizens' individual rights to become who and what they desire to become by use of their own free choice. When this is the precedent and purpose of law, and these laws are enforced by the threat of loss of life or liberty, the natural human is in a constant state of rebellion. This is because it is predisposed to set itself apart from others as an individual. When this standard is forced upon them, humans are thrown out of balance, experiencing unhappiness because they do not feel their self-worth is validated by those attempting to force them to be someone or something they are not. When a standard has been set, a person must both support the standard and conform personal desires, attitudes, feelings, and gestures to the standard or mark set, or else be known as a nonconformist or criminal outside of the law. People are either known and remembered for how well they conform to the accepted standards, or for rebelling against them. Therefore, by our actions, gestures, and outward signs, we fulfill the need to be valued as an individual by leaving our mark upon the society in which we live. Yet, when a human is not being true to the self, as is its natural tendency, a lasting happiness can never be achieved. Humans experience temporary satisfaction until they realize they are no longer individuals, but only a part of the whole. If one cannot gain a sense of self-worth by conforming to the laws of the whole and the accepted standard upon which they are predicated, then the natural tendency is to develop this self-recognition and worth by becoming an outlaw, or a revolutionist determined to promote change or set a different standard. If the revolutionary movement develops strength and becomes physically stronger than the group that set the old standard, then the former flag is thrown down and another is raised in its place, setting a new standard to be enforced. Most people would rather conform than rebel. Behaving acceptably fulfills a human's desire to be valued as worthy based on compliance with the set standard. When there exists no hope for a revolutionary force of substantial strength to overthrow the powers that be, most will relegate and surrender in agreement with the old adage, if you can't beat M, join M. This submission may promise security and liberty, but does not guarantee peace and happiness. A temporary personal satisfaction occurs when a set goal is reached. But when attainment leads to a higher standard being set because someone has already reached and surpassed the original goal, complacency becomes the norm, and personal fulfillment the illusion. Unless one sees the self as an individual of value, he or she will constantly crave to assert the self as acceptable by set standards, or will desire to surpass these norms. At some point in human history, people were convinced that education was the appropriate standard. Obtaining some form of a distinguishing outward gesture allows a person to feel up to par with the set expectation of being educated. Degrees, titles, and honors were developed as outward symbols of conformity. Ironically, those who set the standard for education are the same ones who benefit from it. Professors do not disseminate education for free. Therefore, to leave their personal mark and set themselves apart from the rest of humanity, they convince others that their knowledge is, first, worth knowing, and secondly, worth another's time and money to find out about it. These are similar to the thugs who did not like to work in the fields doing menial labor that produced the basic needs for human survival. Instead of finding glittering gold in a stream to produce captivating pieces of jewelry, they invented the sparkle of an academic degree, which they then used to convince others of their self-worth and assert their individuality. Originally, farmers saw no benefit from sending their children to school when there were crops to harvest. However, seeing the leisurely life an educated professor enjoyed, they hoped their children would not have to work as hard as they did to survive and live up to the standards set by society. Hard-working parents sacrifice for their children and want them to conform to society in ways that they cannot, thus vicariously affecting their own individuality and self-worth by the mark left on society by their children. It was not long before farmers saw their children as valuable assets to the future of the human race, and more importantly, their own self-worth. Therefore, they became convinced that their children were in need of education. But if their children received this education, how would they continue to grow and harvest their crops? This dilemma was solved by finding other creatures who did not fit the standard set for their own children. Their darkened skin naturally classified them as substandard. In their natural state, these substandard creatures lived a lower quality of life with few organized and mandated laws. In comparison, the tribes were certainly uncivilized to those cultures established by the more civilized wise ones. According to the farmer, if these did not live like a normal human being, then they were not considered human, but were viewed as animals that could be domesticated and harnessed as beasts of burden. To leave his mark on the world, a rich farmer or merchant, for example, recognizes himself as wealthy or successful based on the amount of money or product he produces. His self-worth is then determined by the comparison made to other farmers and merchants of like trades who share the same personal goals. If he can convince others, as in the story of Ug and Thug, that his products and services are beneficial to the whole, then he has made himself valuable and has set a mark for which others aim to reach or exceed. If he is powerful, because his club is bigger than another's, or his finger sits on a button that can launch a missile to take away life, he is in a position to protect this standard from any who disagree. At another time in history, a few rich farmers and merchants lived under a crown that set a royal standard expected of all citizens protected under the reigning king's criteria. They decided that in order to establish their self-worth and leave their mark upon society, they had to individually produce more abundantly and possess more than any other. Their standard was set just above the standard of their neighbor. Since each had the same goals, competition began to change the accepted measure until it became an unreachable illusion based on the desire of each to own the land next to his. To maintain his own standard, the king demanded by royal decree the payment of taxes on all that was produced by the rich merchants. The monarchical justification for a tax came from the expense of protecting the sovereignty of the set standard. Yet in his attempt to leave his own mark written in the annals of human history, the king's standard threatened the mark desired to be left by the rulers of some isolated colonial states. These rich colonial kings set their own standard under a new flag, which they presented to the world as the quintessential standard of freedom. At the time of this revolution, the wealthy colonists enjoyed most of the freedoms included in their declaratory and independent standard, except for one: they had to pay taxes to the king. The new kings, some refer to them as founding fathers, decided it would be more advantageous for them to have the people pay taxes to support their standard of living. Their standard included the ownership of land, slaves, those creatures who did not fit their standard, the payment of $300 each to avoid conscription for them and their children, and the exclusion of women, and anyone else who didn't fit their measure, and the right to vote for these standards. With bravado and patriotic rhetoric, these new kings, these wealthy farmers and merchants, have left their mark upon a world that has set them up individually and apart from others as some of the most courageous and intelligent wise ones the world has ever known. This mark has influenced a work ethic and level of excellence that is written upon the hands of all those who indulge in its pursuit. The mark has now become the primary thoughts and desires in the foreheads of their slaves who do not consider themselves as such. This is because their new kings have convinced them that they are not forced to labor, therefore they are not slaves, yet in reality they are forced to labor in order to survive. With intelligent manipulation, these pseudo-slaves have been convinced by their masters that they too can leave their own mark upon the world by working hard in the various fields, so that one day they can be crowned a king too. However, as these slaves toil and labor for these kings, hoping to leave their own mark one day, they begin to see that the closer they get to arriving at the majestic standard, the further away it appears. This is because the king's level must be continuously set a little higher than the rest. Humans desire to be acknowledged and valued for who they are and what they do. The mark that is left by a human in pursuit of its individuality and self-worth is the name by which one person will be distinguished from all others in mortality and remembered after death. The vast extent and importance of the mark is substantiated by the works of the hands and the thoughts in the forehead of each individual. All have received this mark and are enticed to pursue a standard of excellence set by the illusion of human achievement. No one is immune from the innate desire to be of value and leave some symbol of a life lived with purpose and meaning, whether that life is lived according to the standards set by others or by the individual. Humans are deceived by the miracles and the image presented by the beast, who receives its power from the dragon, which is supported by the corruption of man. Prominent in the right hand or upon the forehead of every free-willed wise one is the essence of the individual, the mark of the beast. This concludes 666 The Mark of America, Seat of the Beast, Section 5 The Mark.